Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Gnosis. Now, what is the keys to having extreme abilities particularly? And it all starts with increasing your sensing capacities past the five boring and pretty weak normal senses. Of course, there's a lot more than that in sensing in general, but what does it take to reach high levels of psychic empowerment? Well, there is tried and true ways of doing this. One of the problems is that, as usual, this entire field, like pretty much anything else out there, is clouded with misinformation, disinformation. I believe a lot of this is placed there to disempower you. So you don't really hear the facts or the methods that have been proven for over 60 years. There's a lot of nonsense and gossip coming out of Eastern Europe that the Russians are so advanced. I mean, these are the kind of urban legends that are pretty much just complete garbage. While the Russians don't have the burdenment of silly religious beliefs tying them down, they're certainly not very evolved people. And in general, they're psychics who certain groups were very powerful, that were noted at certain times in the 60s and 70s. Virtually nothing has come out of Russia of any great amount. Now, there is all sorts of data in Russian that you can get to and locate, but most of this stuff has never been translated to English. But what are they really doing? You got to remember, they, like so many other people, have failed in their military conquest. They were kicked out of Afghanistan. They haven't handled too many other situations very well, and they're pretty much known for their unskilled brutality with their special forces, who have not been able to pull off very many missions without major casualties to themselves and to others. Certainly their psychic training hasn't evolved to any great degree. There certainly is nothing coming out of there except for a few groups that are really just sucking in Westerners, making them pay a lot of money. This has been further documented on the Jeffrey Mishlove show, who had a guest on who went over there, and all they did was have them physically work out and do some bizarre types of yoga. All this stuff is just a bunch of nonsense because they don't know anything. Plain and simple. Whoever is talented certainly isn't giving it to others. Of course, they're not giving it to you. I'm assuming the price of this course was very high. But this person even became physically injured, being an older person, I guess, from doing these ridiculous exercises that are supposed to stimulate psychic power. And one of the major tools they were using was turning a wheel on a pin under a glass. If that's advanced, we're in big trouble. So what Eastern Europe has or not is kept very close to them. But as most things coming out from Eastern Europe, unless you have a inside track, so to speak, is pretty bogus. They're going back to a lot of old technologies that their people don't know about, but are Western commonplace, such as negative ion generators and other things such as that. So this is very typical of the fake Russian empowerments that are out there. I contacted them many years ago, and they had absolutely nothing. You couldn't find any psychotronic generators or anything else. They said these were super top secret, and that if you got into these things, you'd end up in the river, meaning they would murder you. So these kind of situations are pretty common. I think everyone should go to the Jeffrey Mishlove channel on YouTube. There's a lot of good information there, and a lot of bad information, a lot of delusional people as well. Mishlove is an interesting character, which I'll do a different video on. But this person who went over there, Nancy Dutertri, who apparently is a lawyer on top of it, assuming again, and this is the urban legend, that these people know anything. And then, of course, following through because she's too cowardice to say, hey, look, buddy, I'm not doing this stuff. Because they walk around acting like they're going to murder you. Very typical of the Russians, and of course, this is great psychic empowerment. Not. It doesn't work like that, and I don't think the Russians know anything. Now, as I said, their open and empowerment that they actually had that was not hampered by religion was powerful with certain people at certain times. Now, there were certain books written, and of course, this is almost ancient. Not almost, it is ancient history. You're talking about almost 50 years ago that books were written about the behind the Iron Curtain psychic experiments. There was Pavlita, the famous Czechoslovakian person who we have videos of him showing his psychotronic generators, which were shapes that produced energy. It's really hard to figure out what's going on there and what's in these machines. They're so odd that we really don't know. And there's very little information about him and his research. And this is very typical. Mostly because of the fact that it's not necessarily kept secret, but nobody's translating it. There was someone translating his stuff years ago, and I don't really know what happened to it. But there's very little translations. There's nothing made. There's no economies in Eastern Europe to any great extent. And I work with a few Russians and other people, and they claim a lot of stuff, but the products they put out are pretty common. I mean, they're good products. There's nothing groundbreaking there, similar to the prana disc that we offer. I mean, this is basically an invention. This is a multi-wave oscillator antenna that certain things are built into, claiming them, that produce okay results. They're good little energy tools. They're far from being profound. So as we move into this kind of thing, and she details the way the Russians were acting, but you walk away. You don't let people. I've seen this time and time again. It shows a person who doesn't have a very. She claims she's very psychic and she has all sorts of contacts, and these stories are the same old things that you hear from these quote New Ager types, and it gets to be kind of boring how helicopters land on their front yards, and I guess she lives in a mansion, being a lawyer and being in the most corrupt industry there is, and wanting to deal in other areas while ignoring the filth that she is in contact with. So I have problems with that as well. But the whole idea is that the story she gives is quite outrageous of how she was guided to solve this problem. She was seriously hurt to the point of being in horrible pain, having some sort of vertebrae snap. Now, I'm not sure if this was, certainly it was brought on by this excessive exercise that apparently was something the Russians thought were so great. Well, they didn't have any secrets, and if your psychic training involves spinning a wheel on a pin, which has been done for 50 years, you're in big trouble. But they didn't have anything else. It was a con game. And of course, if you bitch, they threaten you, like the typical Russians they are, who really have achieved nothing except in World War II against their competition, otherwise known as the Germans, who basically had the same type of system but were competing gangs. You should look at history, people, know what it's about. So the whole idea is that, which of course they now own Germany and all of Europe, being the fact that Eastern Germany, otherwise known as Western Russia, were nothing but Russians who invaded whatever was there in so-called West Germany and have taken it over and made everyone their little slave. So, and what have they done? They've done things through criminal activities, the overrating of their military troops, and even if they have decent supplies, if anything even works from them. All these things are a serious problem when you start looking at Russian technology and what they're able to do. Of course, we use Russian spaceships to go to the International Space Station because we don't got any. So it's kind of amusing when you get into all this. We also have our military with their goofball remote viewing who claim that they have a 60% rate. Whippy! Yeah, 10% over guessing. So the whole idea, this is what you get from the military mind. And of course, to think that the Russians are evolved just because they don't believe in some god form is pretty ignorant in yourself. And the fact is, we have to understand that being non-spiritual, which I'm sure most Russians would say they are, certainly is not a plus when you get into understanding other energies, which tend to blend into a spiritual belief system that connects to some sort of godlike energy. The fact that they also apparently are involved in black magic, heavily using dark energies instead of light. Well, how typical of the Russians, who are pretty much a horrible group of people out there and attacking the West all the time, cyber and otherwise, and who set up giant towers broadcasting negative energies to the West, which this continues to this day. Putin wants to bring back the empire. And there's some even talk that the Russians will be making some dramatic military moves in the next year or so. Well, whether that happens or not, we don't really know. You'd have to think that that's a little ridiculous, but they certainly could. Who's going to stand up to that? Nobody, certainly the Europeans, who are basically are owned by the Russians, and the tiny British army, if they are even not involved with it. But the Germans are all on the Russian team and have been for a long time. After all, they were owned by them. Putin owned them. And Angela Merkel is a Russian, plain and simple. They had the head of the Stasi as the head of the German presidency. So the whole idea is that, again, the ignorance of people in general. But let's get back to the Russians and their particular understanding. So there's really nothing that's come out from Russia. And of course, since they refuse to go into the international community speaking English like everyone does, and a lot of Europeans do that. That's why we don't get much information from anybody in Europe. And still 90% of all important data is in English. And of course, it's the international language of pilots, shipping, you just go on, science, medicine, etc. But yet there's few people who are very literate in it. So if you work in a country that just speaks one language, it's unlikely that you're going to speak other languages even though you learned it. And you're not going to understand it, and if you don't understand it and use it all the time and start reading journals in English, you're not going to understand it. And this is very typical of scientists and doctors from any non-English speaking country. So very little comes from anywhere else, and translations are interesting, problematical, and basically a nightmare if anybody knows anything about translation of non-English language. English is almost pictographic in nature. A word means something. That does not happen. It means a sentence means something in other languages, and these things have to be done properly. And nobody knows how to do that, and certainly trying to translate these other languages with their sexual problems, because every word has a meaning, male, female, or neutral. It's the kind of nonsense you get from these backward-speaking countries. So when you get involved in all this, the Russians are not advanced. What has come from there? Well, I know of a few different courses that have come out of there, and they're all con artists. Every single one of them are trying to teach you. They're using bizarre words. But of course, they're the Russians. They know everything. It's just like Germans make good beer and great cars. This is what everybody assumes, which is a complete lie. So the whole idea is just not true. And of course, your urban legend probably screams at that. Oh, yes. Well, you don't know what you're talking about because you haven't reached gnosis like I have. So the point is, I've done the research. I know what's going on, and you're not going to get anything. So there certainly isn't anything coming from Eastern Europe. From what I've seen from the products that are out there, they're almost entirely copies of American technologies. Coming from people, everybody from Flanagan to the radionics, lots of Tesla stuff. Now, Tesla basically was a naturalized American. He may have come from Serbia or Yugoslavia or whatever, but he lived most of his life in the United States working with Americans and using it. But the point is that all these technologies, these special little antennas and other things that we offer and sell, is all part of the actual reality that we need to handle. So, and understand that this is still all coming from the West. There isn't something specially coming. So, the suppression of psychotronics from from Czechoslovakia that had such very interesting results. The person has now died, and it doesn't seem to be anything known about that. So the whole idea is why there are certain information about that, there doesn't seem to be anything really happening that. It's a lot of gossip and talk. So, but what does it really do? Well, I haven't really seen anything great come out of there. I've checked some new suppliers that are making Dr. Bob Beck tools. This is their advancement. They're copying plans that are on there, making frequency generators, using zappers and other things that they make, silver colloidal units, which are commonplace in the United States. Well, this is what they're offering. So they're not offering anything special, and I don't know of any, quote, psychotronic radionic type machine that is made anywhere in Eastern Europe. Matter of fact, there's very few manufacturers in this day and age, period. There are some in England, but you're not going to find units produced any other place, generally, and there are some, of course, produced in the United States as well. But there's nothing coming out of Eastern Europe to my knowledge. If they are, they're built in very small quantities and distributed to very select groups. Now, how much of the Russian money is still going into these kind of research is really unknown. Just like the American military continues to be involved in so many PSYOP campaigns, remote viewing, hunting psychics and talented people. You know, this is part of the military now. And they've been doing it for 40 to 50 years now. And of course, it started in the early 40s. And could be even in the 30s. That's so many research where people were much more open back then. So all of this is part of it, but they're not going to announce it because of the ignorant public. The ignorant public, of course, is against anything different and unusual. So the whole idea is that the Russians, their advancement, what they can do, what's coming from there. Well, the bottom line is that there's nothing coming unless it's going to secret military governmental sources. And it doesn't seem like most of these things to be particularly out there in any of their practices. I'm not really sure that a Russian has the mentality who wants to punch and blow you up if he's going to sit there and try and psychically manipulate you. Well, they tend to use these energies in the Spetsnaz, their special forces, to a degree, and use some techniques, as even been done by the U.S. Special Forces, trained in certain advanced mental practices, which were done, and certain Green Beret type special forces. How much of that is still going on, we just don't know. But this has been documented and even recorded on videotapes. What's going on, we don't know in these areas, but it's as ultimately powerful as the psychic mind is to do so many things. It doesn't replace guns. It doesn't replace blowing people up. You're going to have to physically go after people. To try and kill somebody on a battlefield with your mind is not really something that can be done right now. So the point is, certainly it has its positive effects when it comes into gaining information and maybe even in disruption fields. But when it comes down to actual combat, psychic empowerments are very limited because it's very difficult to wage a battle that way against anyone. So all of this is something that has to be understood, and it's very important to understand the Russians are not advanced. I don't believe anything they've said, just like the U.S. military is not advanced, and the pathetic demonstrations done by people like the #1 American remote viewer, McGonigal, is pathetic and documented on film by documentaries. He also did it on Nightline about 20 years ago, which I personally watched, and he was pretty pathetic. And claims even today on the Mishlove show, and you can find McGonigal there in his latest interview, that it's 60% accurate. Anything more than that's kind of a joke. Well, that's not what others say, of course, but certainly if you're going to follow the lies and deceptions you get from military remote viewers who are basically just trying to scam you, trying to find people of empowerment so they can use you, is is going to get you nowhere. The people that have the empowerment, as proven in a documentary, when McGonagall went against the psychic who kicked his ass because he got nothing right, and that female psychic got 100% right, is really what's happening. And I think the same thing is happening with the Russians. And whatever powerful people they have or not, which there used to be a region and areas and this was exploited, well, how much of that is still going on is very, very doubtful. We just don't know. But they certainly don't seem to be using it in any kind of way that means anything. Yet, of course, they're open to everything, like all military are. When it comes to money and life and death, most people don't care. What happens? Does it work? So if you use some sort of psychic empowerment, some sort of consciousness machine, and it works, and it saves your life, who cares? If it makes you lots of money, who cares? Anybody that cares about a technology that is manifesting for them, having to want to figure it out, is an imbecile. The bottom line with anything in life is, does it work? Not work for other people, not work in general, but does it work for you? And of course, that's part of this entire quest to high level empowerment. What works for you? And don't get caught up in all these urban myths of certain empowerment by anybody. I've seen so many of these kind of frauds out there, and people who say I've died 20 times. NASA studied me. I did that. I mean, really, what is this nonsense? So they're trying to make themselves very special when you can't really prove any of this. So we have to all be very, very careful when it comes down to believing anybody. And the bottom line, it really doesn't matter if it worked for 1,000 people and it doesn't work for you. It has to work for you. It has to be something that resonates with you, that you can use, and you can empower yourself with it, or it has no value. Now, where that comes from, who provided it for you, well, that doesn't matter either. You have to find out what works for you. There are very few credible organizations out there other than Success Tech. I just don't trust any of these people. They're all in it for the bucks. They're all manipulated by the power structures, whether the governmental controllers. And frankly, I don't see anybody coming out with anything of potent power or anything new except Success Tech. They're beating the same old drum. And that drum doesn't make very good sounds. So, make sure that you carefully look into anything and don't tolerate being abused. And it just amazes me what kind of weaklings people are, because you're told to shut up and get in line. Your bell rings, you go from one class to the other. This kind of brainwave, you stand in line at Walmart and Costco and other places so they can look in your packages that you bought 10 feet away. And that's perfectly okay because you're a freedom guy, right? This is the kind of incessive garbage fed to you that you stand in line to do that and nobody has a problem with it. That is nonsense. Start standing up for things like this, and this goes in any place in your life, or nothing will ever change. So, you know what that means? Nothing will ever change. So, until next time, people, remember there is no reality until a manifesting scientist creates it.